this conversation. I'm looking forward to it being a remote, a robust one. What?
And a remote one.
And a remote one. So very delighted today to have Dr. Sarah Myrie with us. She is a program director for climate advocacy and democracy reform at the Glazer Progress Foundation, but she's here speaking as an individual and with her own perspective and not representing the foundation in this capacity. But I know that experience has provided her with a lot of good insights. She's also a product of the University of Washington, and we're really lucky to have her in the neighborhood.
Fourth generation product too.
Fourth generation. Yeah. Happy to have her in the neighborhood and to be a part of this conversation. So without further ado, let you get started.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm not used to doing this role,
Yeah.
so I'm just gonna quick.
Okay.
So there, Nicole Arid, who is in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of Washington, is online remotely. And I will be helping to moderate the conversation after Dr. Myrie's presentation.
Awesome, and you can keep me on track with the timing too.
Okay.
If we're coming close to the discussion, I really want to make sure there's time for conversation afterwards. Welcome everyone. Hello to everyone that is on the interwebs as well that we cannot see. My name is Dr. Sarah Myrie. I am really excited to talk to you about a whole bunch of stuff today that relate to the pursuit of truth and justice and the opportunities that exist right now for academics, researchers, legal scholars, and public decision makers to execute.
Very.
Well, do the arrows or the space bar work?
I was supposed to, the arrows worked previously.
He just left because I told him we were good to go. Sorry. How should I feel like? Now, can you try?
Okay.
Now, can you go back?
Yep, okay. Awesome. Okay, so my understanding is that there's a really broad range of expertise in the room, and so I want to respect and acknowledge the expertise, and you all know things that I don't know, and vice versa. And so ideally, I'm providing you with context and resources and understanding from my perspective that are useful to you. Background is I'm a trained paleoclimate scientist. I did a PhD from UC Davis. I was an academic here. I was a postdoc at the School of Oceanography. I transferred into philanthropy at the start of the pandemic for career change because I was really tired of the precarity associated with academia. I was a member of UAW, the union here, a very strong supporter of union organizing here at the University of Washington, and more broadly in Washington and nationally as well. So my hope is to give you some context for how we understand extreme weather to be quantified by the scientific community, the approaches that have been taken, why that is relevant in a legal context, and what is happening on the ground right now in terms of the advancement of legal strategies to hold fossil fuel companies accountable for the damages and fraud that they perpetuated on communities, municipalities. So in 2016, the National Academies of Science published their first kind of consensus statement, scientific statement on extreme weather attribution. So this is the work. When I was initially a graduate student, there was a perception because of the chilling nature of working in the public. Academics are often more comfortable taking a step back rather than a step forward to ascertain mechanistic connectivity between extreme weather and climate change. However, we know from the 1960s that there has been a theoretical connection between extreme weather and the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases and climate change. Academic scientists knew this, scientists within Exxon and Shell knew this, so there was an understanding across many types of institutional expertise. So this is a consensus research product that is accessible to any of us. It's a publicly accessible document. I would definitely recommend using it. There's been theoretical framework around how climate change advances extreme weather. This is a canonical diagram of how extreme weather is augmented. It's made more intense and more frequent by climate warming. And so we see mean shifting, we see changing symmetry of the distribution of weather events, and we see increasing variability. So the theoretical ideas that undergird the connectivity between extreme weather and climate change have been used and tested by academic communities, have been vetted and are taught in undergraduate level earth science and weather classes and atmospheric science classes now. So the knowledge has been deeply siloed in academia for a long time, and there are weather organizations and climate communication organizations that are out in front developing analytics that are publicly accessible and digestible and intuitive based on a whole broad range of sort of audience sophistication. This is from Climate Central, which is a national climate and weather communication shop. They are really excellent, delivering evidence-based, scientific, peer-reviewed research to the public. So this is what they call the Climate Shift Index, and they color the weather. This is temperature only. They color the surface temperatures of the United States on an index from less likely to more likely. And when you see that more likely color, the yellow to the red, that means that the weather that we experienced, this was for yesterday, was made 3 times more likely because of climate change. So the heat wave that we are experiencing right now is being in real time attributed to climate warming using this data tool. And this is a tool that's available and refreshed on a daily basis. This is very different than what existed just 2 years ago. And so it shows you the level of sophistication that's being brought to attribution in real time to feed both evidence-based understanding to the weather and to the general public. So you can see in Washington, we had a 3 times more likely heat event yesterday than it would have been likely without greenhouse gases from climate change. Attribution is unspooling across many different domains. This is research that was just published on the 16th, so a couple days ago, by colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And what they are doing is they're quantifying, so this is an exemplar, and we could look across flooding, hydrological events, storm intensity and frequency, fire, heat, extreme cold. We could look across all those events and partition attribution individually and uniquely. What they are doing is looking at the attribution of burned areas in the Western North American continent and how that burn footprint is associated with emissions from the top, I think, 88 fossil fuel companies and producers. So attribution is not just happening based on climate change, we're attributing to point sources now. And that's a really important link, that not only are we able to statistically robustly connect events on the ground to climate change, which was conceptually not imagined when I was a graduate student. That was still like in the ether as something that was desired but was not able to be executed at that time. We are in a different world now, where we are now attributing not only to climate change, but to individual emission footprints of individual corporations. Very important. And so for this research, this is again an exemplar. They looked at this forested area in green across the Western United States and looked at the footprints of wildfire across these different timestamps and attributed the square footage of that fire to partitioning to climate change and then to individual emitters. So the wedge here in red is the area that has been burned because of the emissions of the top 88 carbon producers. So thinking, you know, empirically, rigorously about the ability to partition extreme events, not only to climate change, but also to the behavior of individual companies, is at the root of the process of really revealing the truth and driving towards accountability. In that National Academies of Science report, they built this schemata, and it's conceptual, so you can just sort of follow along. On this x-axis is understanding the effects of climate change on event type, and then the confidence in capabilities of attributing specific events to anthropogenic climate change. And so theoretically, nothing can pass this one-to-one line, this straight line. And for some events, extreme heat and extreme cold, we understand the effect very well, and we have high confidence in attribution. And for other events like severe convective storms or wildfires, we don't have the same degree of confidence. So we work as a community to partition concretely across the different drivers of these events because they're so complex. In 2016, this is where wildfires were. And you could think about that publication from just a couple days ago, advancing this bubble upward in confidence, in understanding, to move upward and outward in higher confidence of understanding the phenomena and higher confidence of being able to attribute the phenomena. So ultimately, as our data sets become more robust, our empirical tools become more effective, all of these bubbles, all of these types of phenomena are going to advance and move in this schemata. So there's a community of researchers that are looking not only at attribution of extreme events, but because we're able to identify those core emitters, those core polluters, at looking at their behavior and how their behavior has driven outcomes for extreme weather and outcomes in the political sphere. So this is a research that was published in 2023 in January by Jeffrey Suprin, Naomi Oreskes, and Stefan Rahmstorf, assessing ExxonMobil's global warming projections. I'm going to just read you some of Jeffrey's synthesis of this work. So their analysis allows for the first time to put a number on what Exxon knew. That burning coal, oil, and gas was going to heat the planet by 0.2 plus or minus 0.04 degrees centigrade every decade. And they were right on the money. Exxon's global warming projections were also consistent with and at least as skillful as those independent academics and government models. And here are some of the statistics. So this is a figure from Exxon. This is Exxon's proprietary figure here from documents that have been accessed through archival processes and under investigative research, where you can see Exxon's figure of atmospheric carbon and average temperature increase. And here's carbon, here's temperature in their predictive modeling from, I believe it's 1970s, or actually maybe mid 60s, early 70s. And then in red is observed temperature change, in blue atmospheric change. So they knew, and they knew really accurately. And Exxon's average projected warming was, with uncertainty, the same as that of independent models. This is really important. They were able to, to buy the most high qualified earth scientists at that time, right? So they had a bench of the most excellent earth scientists delivering these kinds of analyses to them in the 1970s. And then global warming projections modeled by Exxon scientists had an average skill score of 72 plus or minus 6%, with the highest skill score of 90%. For comparison, NASA scientist Jane Hanson's predictions presented to US Congress in 1988 had skill scores of between 38 to 66%. So Exxon knew very, very well. And yet, we have really clear documentation of how Exxon was communicating to the public. So Exxon knew, but they didn't communicate this to the rest of the world. What they did instead is that they purchased PR, greenwashing, and brand management services to narrate their work. And I will just highlight a couple things. This is a call out box from that same research article. In 2000, ExxonMobil's CEO Lee Raymond once former Trump appointee, wrote that, quote, "We do not have a sufficient scientific understanding of climate change to make reasonable predictions and or justify drastic measures. The science of climate change is uncertain." And in 2001, an ExxonMobil Corp press release said of the hockey stick, very classic diagram used, that it showed anthropogenic global warming. The error bars are huge, yet some prefer to ignore them. And injecting uncertainty, injecting false experts into a public discourse around an issue that they had extremely well advanced science undergirding their decision-making as a corporation. In 2013, ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson said, "The facts remain, there are uncertainties around the climate. What the principal drivers of climate change are. There are other elements of the climate system that may obviate this one single variable of burning fossil fuels." And so that's the uncertainty issue. This is just a statement 10 years ago. I was in graduate school at this time. So we know what they were saying and we know what they knew. And we now have airtight, statistically rigorous evidence that Exxon accurately predicted global warming years before it turned around and publicly attacked climate scientists and the science itself. So in that sense, this data, these graphs, don't just communicate a crisis, it confirms complicity. So Exxon is not the only player in these major oil majors. We also have a company called Shell, and I'll give you an exemplar. So data around industry behavior both comes from academic research. It also comes from investigative journalism. And this is an example from investigative journalism, where in March 31st, a trove of once private documents was released to investigative journalists. And these private documents documented that Shell, it advanced the knowledge date from 1972 to 1962, a decade earlier, that Shell understood the decision that it was making. So this is tweets by Ben Franta. Ben Franta is a climate scientist and lawyer and is the lead of the Climate Litigation Lab at Oxford. Here's Ben saying, compiled by Vantan Hoosier, the latest cache of internal documents describes big oil's concealed knowledge of global warming and is a gold mine. One bombshell is a confidential Shell scenario report from 1989, which imagined two futures, sustainable world and global mercantilism. This is really sinister stuff. So Shell realized that even in sustainable world, global temperatures could rise more than 1 degree C. The sustainable world will not prevent the problem arising, but it could mitigate the problem. Global mercantilism, which is the scenario we are living through right now, meanwhile, would cause considerably more warming. What would the world be like under global mercantilism? The path that we're on, according to Shell, there would be more violent weather, more storms, more droughts, more deluges. Mean sea level would rise at least 30 centimeters. Agricultural patterns would be more drastically changed. This language goes on and on and on, detailing to the minutia the consequences of the scenario that they have chosen. But what these documents underscore is that Shell knew the fact that the fossil fuel industry and broader society had a choice, and they knowingly chose global disaster in exchange for short-term profits. Pretty chilling. So you might think, well, okay, investigative journalism, it gets put into Smog blog. Where do these documents go? Well, you can look at the dates here. This is March 31st, and then just 7 days later, there is an amicus brief filed in the circuit court in DC, informing the court of the evidence that come from these documents in a case between the District of Columbia and ExxonMobil and defendants, which include Shell. So these documents, this is stuff that's happening definitely in real time and has a major impact on the legal scholars, the legal theories to advance the opportunities to execute justice for plaintiff communities. So let me just pause here. There is a history of the United States legal system addressing corporate fraud and damages. And one of those examples is tobacco. And we know in the zeitgeist that tobacco causes cancer, that it's really harmful, and that tobacco companies rallied against the knowledge of tobacco being connected with cancer for decades. They had they executed in the same way these really well-informed PR schemes to flood the marketplace with imagery and advertising and messaging that made tobacco seem cool and disconnected from the actual public health consequences of tobacco. And so what happened is that there was a rabble, a rising crew of litigators that were concerned about public health consequences of tobacco. And on a state-by-state basis, lawsuits began to emerge based on legal theory that says if you are lying about a product and you know it's dangerous, that's fraud. If your products are damaging the public, that's something that that's legal, there's legal recourse for in state law. And so what happened is that so many of these forms of litigation amassed. I think there was like 45 different state attorney generals at the end. That what happened is the defendants, the tobacco companies, agreed to a master settlement. And the master settlement was the largest payout of money in the history of law at that time. And it delivered money to states, to public health infrastructure, for people who had experienced, to individuals and wrongful death cases. Some of that money went into UCSF and built what we call the Industry Document Archive, which is an institution that houses legal documents of corporate behavior, which now includes opioids and lead paint and asbestos and tobacco and now fossil fuel documents as well. They agreed, the tobacco companies agreed, we will no longer lie about our products. So one of the things about climate change people don't recall or reflect is that oil and gas companies and coal companies are able to lie about their products in public, unlike tobacco companies, because the tobacco companies went through the master settlement agreement, and that constrained their public speech to a lane based on the outcomes of that agreement. And we don't have that right now for any of these oil majors. And this is a narrative that is like in the zeitgeist. People don't necessarily remember. And I think it's important to get grounded about what happened. And one of the things I would recommend is go watch this movie, The Insider, with Russell Crowe. It is a true crime retelling of Jeffrey Wigand, who was a former tobacco scientist and executive that was a whistleblower for the litigation against tobacco companies. This is Jeffrey Wigand's like Wikipedia entry. He's a real guy. His life was destroyed by the tobacco companies. His marriage fell apart. He had all these financial consequences. His career fell apart because he stood up to the industry, and the industry behaved like organized crime against him. So The Insider is this really great theatrical examination of what happened in the tobacco litigation. It's very, very relevant for other forms of corporate litigation. So the same kind of state-by-state advancing theory is happening right now to address the fact that fossil fuel companies, we understand from these documents and the historical evidence that's been amassed, that they knew that their products were dangerous. They lied to the public, and their products have created massive damage across public infrastructure, public health, well-being, and also to the extent that also to wrongful death. So there's an enormous liability that these companies have not addressed yet, which is their behavior since 1962, damaging and hurting people and causing municipalities extensive financial losses. So this is an image from the Center for Climate Integrity, which is an NGO. It's a 501c3 organization, and it depicts the forms of litigation, the location of the litigation that's advancing right now. These are litigations that are happening led by state attorney generals and led by counties. And the defendants are oil majors. So they're Exxon, Shell, Suncor, and on and on. And those are the same kinds of entities that we would ascribe to those top 80 emitters that was in that initial research analysis that I showed you about wildfires. So we're talking about the same major emitters and their impact. So the legal framework that exists to pursue accountability includes both common law torts, product liability, consumer protection, and racketeering. And for those that are not legal scholars, so I'm not a lawyer. I have built some familiarity with these frameworks because they're a really relevant and very powerful part of US state law that allows for state attorney generals to pursue compensation for damages and fraud that happen to people in place in their states. The RICO is a little bit different. This is the Racketeering and Influence Corrupt Organization. This is federal law. There are now 2 RICO cases against oil and gas companies, one in Puerto Rico and one in New Jersey. So this is a bit different, but in a sense, these are legal frameworks by which other corporate behaviors have been litigated. And that framework exists for us to pursue compensation and really justice for plaintiff communities. Like ultimately, you know, I'm here not as an advocate or an organizer, but an individual that would really like to see justice for plaintiff communities and harm redressed. And the key message that I have for us today as an academic, as I'm trying to build this sort of concept and framework, is to think collectively about what is the responsibility of researchers in all of this. Because the US justice system needs a basis of evidence and truth to examine the impact and damage and deception and fraud. And so the expertise of the folks in the room and your colleagues are highly relevant to be able to truth tell what's happening in this world around us. Because as we saw yesterday, just yesterday, we are 3 times out of the window of what normal weather would look like in the Pacific Northwest without the influence and the consequences of climate change. So this is really important news. It's April 24th. This is less than a month ago. One of these cases, this is in Colorado. The oil and gas majors have been trying to move these state by state cases out of the states and into the Supreme Court, saying this is not a state issue, this is a Supreme Court issue. And what that is a petition to remove the cases out of Supreme Court. So there was a removal petition for this case in Colorado that was on the Supreme Court's docket. And all the other cases essentially were stalled out because of this decision by the Supreme Court to hear or not hear this removal. So what the Supreme Court decided was to not hear the removal and sent it back, saying these are cases that are going to go to trial in state courts, which is, it's hard to overstate what a watershed moment that is, because what this means is that these corporations are going to go through discovery in state courts, and we are going to learn, there's going to be a process, a bright light of truth is going to be shown on the behavior and the knowledge of these corporations. And these state courts, they need a bench of evidence supplied by academics that is, it's an unbiased understanding of what the truth is about the physical and social science of climate impacts in those states. So absolute watershed moment for the pursuit of damages and fraud in the legal system. And this stuff continues to advance just incredibly rapidly. Only 2 days ago, it's 19th now, on the 16th, Hoboken in New Jersey, this is the RICO case that I referenced, bring charges against big oil for racketeering. So this will only advance quicker and quicker and quicker in this field because of the basis of evidence and the interest in attorney generals and public leaders in advancing just outcomes for plaintiff communities. So back to this. So what does this mean? Like, here we are in Washington, and I put this WTF, like, what is happening, right? We don't know. This is a non-analog Washington state. This is a state of Washington that has not existed before. And I think sometimes we gloss over the imperative of really looking carefully at details and really looking carefully at the outcomes that individuals and businesses and municipalities are experiencing because of extreme weather. And that detailed focus is where I really want to draw that academic expertise in, because you have the ability to focus in and choose places to study and choose questions to ask that allow us to investigate and clarify what are the outcomes, what is the cost, what are the harms being done, what are the unknown sort of system-wide complexities that occur when extreme weather, heat, flooding, and smoke, wildfires are occurring at non-analog scales in our state, and the people in our state are experiencing the ramifications of those things. So I'm going to give you an example, one that's really, really personal to me. And so this is where I'm basically going to speak as a Washingtonian, right? And so this is about the floods in Whatcom County in 2021. If you remember, there was this really, really catastrophic weather event. And this is a headline from KUOW. A ghost river showed its face during the recent Nooksack floods. What's a ghost river? Fascinating. So here's a topography of Whatcom County. Here's Bellingham. There's White Rock and Abbotsford, the North Cascades. There's Mount Baker. I'm going to overlay a map of just the major tributaries of the North Fork. This is the North Fork of the Nooksack. This is where the Nooksack River flows out into Bellingham Bay currently in modern times. So what happened in this flood is that the Nooksack River takes this big turn right here around Linden. And the floodwaters were so great in the Nooksack River that the Nooksack River flowed backwards into the across the Canadian border into the Fraser River Valley, across a river channel that had previously existed tens to hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so again, a non-analog example of the hydrological system in Whatcom County completely like outpacing any modern framework for understanding what this river system would do. And it was so catastrophic that the river flowed backwards and flooded all of these farmlands up in Linden, costing people their homes. Hundreds of cattle, hundreds to thousands of cattle died. People's businesses were wiped out. Really, really catastrophic. A state of emergency was declared for Whatcom County. These are real people. This is real money. These are our neighbors. Like, these are the people that I grew up around, and living through a kind of event that outstrips anything that we know in human history, I think it's safe to say. So there are still headlines being broken, but this was just 1 year, this is 2022, all hell broke loose 1 year post-flood in Whatcom County, where they're doing a retrospective about the outcomes for businesses and communities and farms and people's homes. And the answer is still bad, not good. Like the impacts of an extreme event like this are retained in those communities. And for me, I have a personal story, which is that there's in the North Cascades, there's a creek that flows into the Nooksack River, a creek that I have been going to with my kid. And I've been going there since I was 19. And it's called Canyon Creek. And during the flood event, what happened is that the floodwaters were so extreme, that I'll go over here. You can see the bank. This is the topsoil right here. This is about 10 feet from the topsoil down to where the water is right here. That the creek was completely scoured away. I mean, thousands and thousands of cubic feet of soil were just excavated from this creek. Catastrophic to the point that it was humbling to go back there to investigate what's happened to this creek. And amazingly, the creek revealed, so this had been a feature, all of this Chuckanut sandstone had been under 10 feet of soil. This was a buried river creek feature from 10,000, 20,000 years ago that no water had flowed through in likely thousands of years to tens of thousands of years. And the advancement of this event undercovered this beautiful feature that created this just remarkable swimming hole that we now return to. But you can see the scouring here and this this nature of this non-analog extreme event that we're living through has, I think it's very profound when you sit in a place like this and you see that it's ripped a hole in the earth and revealed like a waterfall that hadn't had water flowing through it in tens of thousands of years. Just remarkable. So this is a personal anecdote, but I think if you were around in 2021 for the heat dome in June 2021, you might remember the fear, the risk, the crisis that we all lived through. You might remember your home being almost unbearable. Maybe you fled to the coast, maybe you fled to a hotel room, maybe your dog got sick. The heat dome of 2021 was the most dangerous and lethal weather event ever recorded in the Pacific Northwest in history. And this really matters. This is back to like, where is the bright light of truth and understanding being shown by the academic community as these events progress so very rapidly and have such profound consequences to the lives of people around us. So this is an analysis of King County heat deaths in the 3-day heat dome event of 2021. And this is nighttime temperature in this color bar, where you can see here's 405 and the I-5 corridor right here. Here's the airport. And on the east side of 405 into the foothills, you can see a 30-degree, 25-degree difference in nighttime temperatures in these foothill, so this is a place where there's soil and the heat is being absorbed, whereas this is concrete and the heat is being retained like an oven, and that oven is altering this built environment in really significant ways for nighttime temperatures. And there's a real concrete overlay between where people died and where the retention of that heat occurred. And there's all these conversations and investigations to be done about who these people were, how this happened, what systems failed around them, how did the county fail, how did the city fail, what could have prevented these deaths. This is ongoing work that is highly relevant to the lens around accountability that I want us to bring back to, because we have a legal system that says it's not okay. It is not legal for corporations and or individuals to lie about products and hurt people and to damage public infrastructure and public well-being. And there's recourse that is available through legal processes, and those processes are underway right now. And I want to just welcome everybody to thinking about this as concretely as they possibly can, because this is a vital pursuit of a process of adjudicating justice for people who have been harmed. And while this is not the way that we solve climate change, I don't want to narrate this as the ultimate focus on how to solve climate change. We have to have legal approaches that address the malfeasance of these industries. And so this needs to sit appropriately in a lane, and it's a very academic lane. It's in a lane of legal scholarship. It's a lane of evidentiary basis. It's a lane that uses public health, extreme weather attribution, uses a whole suite of analytical and statistical tools, and social science and physical science. And so there is space in this lane for pretty much every type of academic to be involved as an expert, as a citizen, and as a steward of processes to adjudicate justice for plaintiff communities. So that is the end of my, oh, wait a second. No, not the end. So I am not the only sort of former academic or folks that is turning towards this. This same group of scientists from the Union of Concerned Scientists focused on this synthesis of holding fossil fuel companies accountable. What do we need to do? And I think that their bullet points are right on. So let's just go through them real quickly. So state governments and officials have a really important role to play in holding companies accountable for the harms that they have caused. So what should we do? We need to preserve access to justice through the courts for people in communities experiencing climate impacts. We need to account for the major financial and economic risks posed by climate change when making investment decisions on behalf of constituencies. We have to pressure fossil fuel companies and their investors to stop engaging in greenwashing and funding the spread of climate disinformation, fully disclose the climate impacts and economic risks of their business model and of their products. In the same way that tobacco companies had to disclose, we know these products cause cancer on every single carton of cigarettes that they sell, and update their business models to enable sharp emission reductions for their products and operations at a pace and scale consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So this is a consensus science statement that's been vetted through peer review. And I think it's important to be able to turn towards statements like this and the full strength that they bear in, again, the pursuit of justice. So with that, that is my final slide. And I'm happy to take discussion questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, sorry. That was an excellent presentation. Am I going to start here?
Please go ahead.
Okay, super. So I'm a public health researcher, and I was very struck by what you said and the parallels you were making between the tobacco industry and climate change. And more recently, I was thinking of the opioid crisis and associated litigation. And for both of those, as a public health researcher, I think about the substantial investments by the federal government in research related to identifying those health consequences so that we can hold folks accountable. And I've been bringing it to the end of your presentation and the kind of imperative of researchers to do this kind of work. And, after the heat dome event, I had several colleagues who were very interested in quantifying the health effects of that event. And they ran into several challenges, some of it related to funding and finding resources to do that kind of work, as well as things that were more just logistical due to lack of investment in this space. And that included lack of data that was available from public health agencies, lack of capacity to get rapid institutional review board approval, not necessarily at the University of Washington, where we have a fantastic IRB, but elsewhere, and other types of challenges that come up as we do this research. And so I'm wondering, kind of tying that all together, if we as researchers have a role, which I agree with you that we do, in identifying these health and well-being consequences in communities, how do you think we can push to get the resources and infrastructure that we need to be able to fulfill that role? Because right now, I don't think that we're there to be able to step into that in a way that is that meets the magnitude of the demand and the urgency of the problem.
I'm just going to add a quick, my comment was similar to Nicole's, and Nicole's is excellent. You said we need to focus in on places, and in your map was map of Washington, but for those deaths, they're in particular places, and high resolution data of people and what's happening on the ground about people is really not available in a meaningful way. And that's one of the biggest challenges for those of us who are in social sciences, is bringing those small area high resolution information about people in to connect with events.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nicole, I think it is very hard to do impactful and publicly relevant and work that is able to turn on the dime with the nature of these events happening in real time. So I just want to acknowledge that this is a tall ask, and this is not the kind of ask that academia is usually requested to play. And I think that there are, of course, structural barriers, and there's barriers within, I think, institutional leadership. So there are forms of complicity with fossil fuel companies that we see even at the highest levels of University of Washington leadership. And so one of the most effective ways that researchers can push this forward is identifying arenas within their institution themselves that need to change. And so accountability comes home at different levels. And there's absolutely an accountability level here for University of Washington's behavior in complicity in not divesting from fossil fuels themselves. So that's one reflection I have. The other reflection is that this is only going to become more and more hyper relevant, and the barriers are part of the research project and research question at hand. So I think turning the focus and the curiosity towards where do the barriers exist, why are they there, what are the forms of data that we don't have access to, where is that data available elsewhere, being curious about how those barriers become are overcome, I think is as relevant to the research questions themselves. And so I don't want to simplify the narrative here and say this is just about pivoting. This is not. This is about reorganizing the way that we think about the servicing of the US legal system with evidence and data and high quality analysis from public health and physical science experts that can speak to the moment. And I don't think any of us got into this career to be able to play this role. This is really outstrips most of our visioning as academics. But I think it's just true. And that unfortunate truth, I think, should drive forward an ambition, a recommitment, because this is ultimately about public service and being an effective public servant and being able to have integrity in the service that you're bringing to, the state of Washington as a whole.
Do you have a response, Nicole?
No, I mean, I completely agree. And that's, been a lot of the space that we've done work here at the University of Washington and trying to figure out what are those barriers to doing this kind of work and trying to develop solutions to be able to rapidly respond. I still think the, resourcing issue, NIH has recently launched a climate and health initiative to be able to build some of this capacity, but we're just late to the game. And I think, we need to catch up quickly and it's going to be a challenge. So I think, building that capacity is critical.
Yeah. I know that there's an emphasis, there is work being done on the divestment. Students have been leading that, again, undergrads have been leading that effort, but there has been effort with the regions to divest on fossil fuels. Does anybody in the audience have a question, or we don't want to? I don't have my clock on me. Yes, Jess. Maybe you can introduce yourself a little to Sarah.
Sure. Wait, to who?
Sarah.
Oh, yes. So I introduced myself mainly, but I didn't mention that I have been working a little bit on thinking about how housing as a structure can mediate or moderate outcomes for individuals in the advent of climate events. And to that end, I have a question, right? So like you're framing this rightfully as like the fault of a few major players. And then when we look at how we are responding to these events, right? We can't go back to the 60s and stop this from happening. I would love to hear your thoughts on both governmental response and insurance industry in how they are complicit in perhaps reproducing harms and where the idea of retreat versus rebuilding comes in. It's right. They're not the cause of these harms,
right.
But what is the role in those and perhaps other major players?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, we still subsidize fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel export and production and subsidize fossil fuel pipelines. So at the federal level, the subsidization of this energy system is atrocious. It's infuriating. It's not evidence-based, and it's not what the majority of the electorate want as outcomes from the federal government. So this is about the erosion of democratic norms and our ability to have majority rule in this country. We don't have an effective process by which a majority can be determined and that majority can execute legislation because of the behavior of the political right. And it's a really, really big problem. And this is why the climate crisis is a political crisis. It's not a crisis. It's not an environmental crisis. It's a political crisis because we know exactly what needs to be done and we have exactly the tools to do it. And we're being blocked by the interests that are aligned with oil and gas companies at the very highest levels of decision making. And so that's just true. And yet we are trying to assess where are the ways to incorporate the externalities of this business model that they've executed and all the ancillary business models around it: insurance, PR companies, academic institutions, industry groups like the American Petroleum Institute. There are all of these entities around oil majors that have facilitated and expedited their ability to make more money than has ever been made in the history of money by these companies, and for these companies to be subsidized and facilitated by elite decision making. So that liability extends to all of the institutions around it. And I think when institutions that have, accepted oil money for building buildings, accepted fossil fuel money for research imperatives, there's a whole degree of liability that institutions across this suite are going to have to examine. And I think institutions make decisions based on liability. And so pushing forward the advancement of theories of change based on liability is very effective because there's no moral imperative that we can bring to these institutions to say, hey, you're killing people. This is bad for us. We don't like it. It's bad for your grandkids. It doesn't work with this class of actors. They don't care. They're shameless. And that shamelessness makes them effective because they can't be shamed by pro-social narratives. They can only act under a monetary imperative for themselves and their shareholders. And that is true of oil companies, and it's unfortunately true of the University of Washington. And so addressing opportunities to expose liability is one of the core ways that we advance processes for pursuing justice for people that have been hurt, places that have been hurt.
Just a quick, we have a chat here from Heather Price who says, related to UW students with institutional climate action are doing an action today to push UW to decarbonize it. UW Red Square at 4 p.m.
Very supportive of that.
Alyssa Paletti has a comment too. This has been a fantastic talk. I'm a grad student at UW in atmospheric science.
Hi, Alyssa.
Do you see a role for idealized climate modeling in climate accountability and litigation?
Well, it depends on the litigation, and there are all these different legal theories that need to be informed by really robust evidence. And some of those legal theories are operating at state level in the US, and some of those theories are operating at the international level, like the UN International Court on Human Rights is evaluating cases right now based on the accountability by nation states to act in the face of knowledge about climate change. And so there's never going to be a time when we're done with climate models. We are always going to need really, really fine-tuned, effective, scaled climate models to understand what's happening around us. And that expertise, like developing that bench of expertise, and I'll just speak for what is the role for academics, like thinking about your role in litigation. So this is now coming from having gone through Expert Witness Training Academy. There's an Expert Witness Training Academy that the National Science Foundation funds every year and brings in a cohort every year to train at Mitchell Hamline College of Law in the Twin Cities. to help academics understand how to function in the courtroom, how to function in front of lawmakers, and essentially how to use evidence and data to interface with the legal system itself. And so if you are in a position to really be an expert, to testify in front of court about the health implications, the analyses that you're able to bring to bear that functionally connect emissions and decision-making by emitters to outcomes on the ground, my recommendation is to be extraordinarily careful about how you communicate in public. And the reason why is this, because the oil companies have immense resources to fight this fight. And those resources are going to be brought to bear for every single expert that is going to give testimony. And if you've ever tweeted, "I'm so angry at oil companies for their bad behavior," that tweet's going to come back at you in a court of law. And that's why this ends up being really challenging, because we as citizens, we are trying to push against the democratic process that needs our voices engaged, right? We need to say, hey, it's not fair that these impacts are happening. And yet there's this strategy that you want to be careful about if you are an expert, to be able to really be in the right place in the right time to speak to that judge or speak to that jury, and not implicate yourself as somehow like part of a political, agenda. Because as academics, the agenda that you're advancing of truth, of clarity, of being able to clearly understand how things are happening, that is an amazing skill that has such power in these places. So protect that skill as much as you can as you move forward with your career.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sam Sellers. I used to be a postdoc here, but now I work in federal government. And you've emphasized data and evidence and the importance of good information in fostering accountability. But maybe I'm being overly cynical, but I don't think that's enough. That for the courts to hold fossil fuel companies accountable to facilitate justice, I think ideally we want them to think that they look at the information and they look at the law and they make a ruling that is in accordance with that information. But that's not the way that they function. There's other considerations that they have when making decisions. And so as you think about improving the quality of data and evidence to facilitate climate litigation, how does that interact with other considerations that the court may be thinking about when weighing different rulings? If you were to actually account for all the damages that Exxon caused, you'd be looking at trillions of dollars in judgments that could bankrupt the company, and it could affect the economy in ways that are unpredictable. So how do you structure evidence in combination with other factors to try to get the courts to rule in a way that you want them to, but that also fosters justice?
So that's been the exact theory of retaining these cases in state court and having them not advance to federal courts based on the appointments of the Trump judges in the Supreme Court. So there is absolutely a strategy being executed here that's not just about the evidentiary basis, but about the opportunities that exist within the legal system to pursue justice based on the political nature of the courts themselves. And what we are seeing is, because the Supreme Court refused to hear this removal case, that balkanizes this legal fight into state courts. And that is very good, because it allows for this evidence to be heard in state courts in places it's never been heard before. And there's no way I can promise you success through this process. I can only communicate the imperative of pursuing opportunities that exist for people that have been harmed and for places that have been damaged. And I think this is why this is a deeply interdisciplinary process, because you have to stay in your lane. Like, if you're an academic, you're a researcher, you're going to do research. do that and stay in that lane and be really good in that lane. And trust that your tools, your data, your analyses can be used by colleagues in a totally different lane. And that lane is going to be people who are campaigners and organizers. That lane is going to be legal scholars and lawyers, attorneys who are executing representation for the plaintiff communities. So I think until you have cynicism for the strategy that's being executed in lanes around you, you want to get curious about what actually is the theory of change operating in those lanes. And where are the barriers? Like, where are those individuals worried? And how are they thinking about the advancement of the placement of these cases, of the nature of the evidentiary basis, the role that, US litigation plays in then informing litigation internationally? Because these companies have never gone through the legal process of discovery, we've been looking at them. This is a quote now from Jeffrey Suprin, just in the New York Times from yesterday. We've been looking at these companies through a keyhole, trying to understand what they knew. But what discovery does is it opens the door and it allows us to see directly. And this is very similar to what just happened between Fox and Dominion. So Fox and Dominion Voting Systems filed a lawsuit against Fox, and they went through discovery and they exposed Fox's behavior and all of the internal communications and all the texts and emails, and showed them, oh, this is not a media corporation, this is a propaganda organization. And they then settled. They didn't go to court. They didn't sit in front of a judge and a jury. But what that discovery process did is it released evidence into the public that exposes Fox then to a bunch of other different kinds of liability, shareholder liability and liability from other companies and voting systems. So that's an outcome. And that could be the same kind of outcome we see potentially with this litigation against oil majors, is that the process of discovery allows for the expansion of liability, both in the US and internationally, because what we really want to do is just know the truth. What did these companies do? When did they know? How did they do it? And that itself, we don't have yet. We think we know, and we have a lot of evidence based on investigative journalism and historical research. But ultimately, again, we've been looking at them through a keyhole, and this is going to allow us to open the door.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Thank you, Nicole, for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Sorry I couldn't be there in person.